This is the story of HouseEurope, a European citizens' initiative with a clear goal to make the renovation of existing buildings faster, cheaper, and easier, and stop their demolition and reconstruction. It began, as so many stories do, with an old building that should have been demolished and thrown away to make room for a new one. Yet, existing buildings hold so much within: stories, spaces rich with life and energy from the past. Potentials for tomorrow, all of it available today, at the prices of yesterday. But despite these potentials and all arguments, no one cared. Neither the owners, nor the banks, nor the politicians. Because the loss of homes, the loss of energy, and the loss of history hold no price in our current system. At that moment, it became clear this wasn't just about one building. Saving one building would make no difference. What was needed was a change of direction, a new common path to stop this demolition drama and relentless cycle of destruction, and instead to empower renovation. But to do this, we must first understand, how does the construction and real estate system function and affect our ecosystems, both economy and ecology? And crucially, how does the system not only shape our buildings, but influence us, our homes, our neighborhoods, and our communities?
So the point about land is that it's finite. I think it was one of the Marx brothers who said, we don't make it anymore. So there's a finite amount of land within an international financial system where there's an infinite, almost infinite supply of credit, right? And so if you want to know why the price of land has risen, then you have to look at the financial system and you have to look at the amount of money, the wall of money that's aimed at this thing, which is the finite resource called land. When you throw money at something finite, everyone knows the price goes up, right? The thing about this finite land is that it's not just a property for someone to live in or to work in, and that it might increase in value. It is also collateral, right? You can take this property, you can buy this property, you can throw money at it and pay a huge amount of money for it, and then immediately you can use it as collateral to borrow even more money. If you are a private equity firm, a Wall Street bank, a hedge fund, or an asset management fund, and that is why land and housing and property is now so important to the finance sector. The finance sector can't manage without it because the finance sector needs collateral. You can't borrow money unless you can show that you have collateral that could be used in case of default. And so property is a wonderful thing for that purpose. And so here in Britain, we have a wall of global money coming from Russian oligarchs, coming from Chinese oligarchs, coming from Nigerian oligarchs, coming from Wall Street banks, mainly Wall Street banks, aimed at the tiny island that is Britain and the finite amount of land. And so what we have are house prices and property prices going through the roof.
So the built environment is one of the most valuable assets in today's globalized speculative economy. That is part of a bigger story that has been unfolding in finance capitalism over the last many years. This is something that shows in particular the role that finance has been having in our lives, the way in which it has been shaping our lives and our understanding of who we are, how we relate with the world around us, and of course how we inhabit the built environment, how we create it, how we adjust it to the needs of the market. Finance is this very powerful force that, through its speculative logic, is the driving force behind real estate, assigning value through markets onto goods, onto material goods.
I think when we talk about value creation in the city, then the biggest question is, where does the value of land, of urban land, ultimately comes from? And if you ask people who buy and sell real estate, they will tell you there's three things that contribute to the value of land in the city: location, location, and location. Of course, we know it, right? We know that it is about what is close and what is far that makes the land so pricey in the city. But then if we take one more step back and ask, where does this value of location comes from? then of course it is collectively created by people in the city. I think that's the biggest fraud in the real estate speculation, that you take value that is collectively and historically created by people in the city, then you try to extract it from the very people who created it.
By the term financialization, I refer to the process by which the forces and the imaginary of finance, the imaginary of markets, has become an integral part of our everyday life across the social domain, the political domain, even the intimate domain. Our everyday lives are now shaped by the priorities of financial markets. What this looks like on any given day is that we wake up, we take our very small family, personal, work decisions according to the logic of finance. We see things as a constant process of balancing risk and opportunity. The most obvious impact there is that we no longer merely associate the built environment with fulfilling a basic need for housing, for the safety and security and the comfort that this can provide, but we see it as an investment. That is a very important impact of financialization. That is, not just real estate actors are seeing our houses as an investment opportunity, but we, everyday people, everyone in society at the moment has an intuitive understanding where they sleep is not just material, it's an asset.
When we think about value, what does it mean that things have value? I mean, it's a word that we use in the everyday life. And if you think about your home has a value for you, not only because you can sell it. It has emotional value, it has sentimental value, it has practical value of you having a place to sleep and somewhere to store your memories. And I think the big cheat of economy is collapsing all different kinds of value into one very abstract monetary value that is supposed to replace and exchange them. And through this process of abstraction, it also destroys these other kinds of value.
The real tragedy of this conspiracy by speculators, real estate developers, is that they're doing it in secret and we know nothing about it. We are not interested, on the whole, in the way the financial system operates. We are preoccupied with day-to-day affairs. We worried about sex. We worry about relationships next door. We worry about immigrants. We spend a lot of time worrying about immigrants. And so we happily forget about and exclude those speculators and those real estate developers who are planning this moment to destroy the very fabric of our society so that they can make more money. If your land is finite, the only way you can keep reinvesting it and keep generating returns is by destroying it and starting again.
Is everything in the city up for demolition? I mean, potentially yes, because if we approach the land and the city through the speculative lens, then of course the biggest increase in value is through this constant demolition and rebuilding. And if you look at American cities, if you look at the history of New York, that's pretty much what happened and how the value was created. Now, in Europe, for years, it was a little bit different, but through the financialization and globalization of economy, Europe was also pulled into this cycle of demolition and creation.
This phenomenon is happening because economists, mainstream orthodox economists, have dictated this sort of policy. And it happens at two levels. On the one hand, the economics profession, and it is incredibly ideological. It's so wrong to think of economics as a science. It is a social science and it's very ideological. And the main thrust of today's economics is liberalization. It's neoliberal economic theory. On the one hand. On the other hand, economics dictates that actually there is no problem for the environment.
And it becomes a game of minimizing risks into a broader speculative market in order to attract the right investments that would allow you to survive as a housing association, as a housing structure. Of course, this is an argument that many have made. This leads not only to theoretical problems or to housing difficulties, but also to disasters like the Grenfell Tower collapse and the fire in London a few years ago. There you have a really palpable example of how the logic of financial speculation and the integration of real estate leads to the actual loss of life, not only to the degradation of livelihoods of residents, but to the actual loss of life.
And so it was misused, systematically misused, to get the tenants out and to create this idea that it's either or, that it's either social values and low rents or ecological transformation. And this is harmful on many levels. It's harmful socially, but this is harmful on even bigger level because it does create this conflict that actually doesn't exist. It's not either or.
The economics profession are those men are the guilty men. They have driven both the financing of our architecture, of our urban planning, and also, of our residential homes.
So how do we actually change the system? It's a bit of a push and pull idea, no? So you can forbid certain things and incentivize others. And there I think that it's important to turn back to the public and how much can we as citizens also demand change at legal level, but also how these changes will affect us as citizens.
It is part of this speculative game that buildings have become the most valuable physical asset in the world, with over 50% of global capital now invested in real estate, putting profit over people and the planet. And we are part of this system. The construction sector is the largest producer of CO2 emissions. Functioning buildings are being demolished and replaced, not because it's necessary or leads to better buildings, but because currently the old cannot compete with the new. And we are supporting this system. Every year, thousands of houses and millions of square meters of existing space are thrown away, making the construction sector the biggest producer of waste in the European Union. By 2050, we will have demolished approximately 1.5 billion square meters of existing space, more than the entire cities of Athens, Berlin, Bucharest, and Paris combined. Enough living space to house around 50 million people. While the system may seem abstract, the consequences are very real and deeply affect our daily lives. To change it, we must understand the true costs of demolition and reconstruction for the planet, the labor market, our history, and our communities.
When a building is demolished, usually what it is replaced with is not to the benefits of the people who were occupying the previous building. And in that sense, the city loses its kind of social mixity, diversity, and, more generally, the kind of heterogeneity that makes them desirable. Which means that, by extension, demolition is an antisocial phenomenon.
The example we saw, where you see that, the demolition of particular buildings, supposedly to put better buildings there. It's not about better buildings. The demolition gives them a pretext to remove a particular class of people from a particular part of the city that lends itself to making more money if there are other people there. It's a sort of Umwandlung of entire areas.
This construction sector is an entire ecology. It is made of real estate investors, financing bodies, regulators, architects, contractors, real estate again, and then potentially users. And all of that is this ecology of construction. Within the construction industry, there is debate about how much of this 40% is really related to construction and how much is related to use. All in all, it's 40%. The roles of these actors, of these construction industry actors, are divided but all connected to one another. I like to call this a chain of space production, like you would think of a commodity chain.
When you demolish a building, many things happen. So first of all, you lose all the CO2 that was consumed to build the original building. Then you have a huge amount of trucks that have to move all the debris. But it's incredible if you think of it. So the traffic will be congested. Then you have fine dust particles. And Belgium is one of the countries in which this phenomenon has been studied. And it has been proven all these fine dust particles that come from traffic and from demolition, they affect your lungs, and especially in children. So you have health issues that are caused by demolition.
It's interesting in some ways that probably, building all the large-scale housing estates meant an enormous amount of CO2 emission when they were built, but that's done. I mean, that CO2 is in the air. It takes a lot of CO2 emission to demolish all of them and build new stuff. In a way, you could, by preserving them, you could undo some of the CO2 guilt from previous decades.
Wenn man sich das mal vor Augen führt, dann kann man sich ungefähr vorstellen, wie viel Ressourcen benötigt werden. Für ein Einfamilienhaus sind 200 Tonnen Sand zum Beispiel. Sand ist auch ein endliches Gut. Das steckt alles in so einem Gebäude mit drin. Und die Energie muss natürlich eingesetzt werden, um das entsprechend in Form zu bringen, also die Produkte überhaupt mal herzustellen. Je nachdem, um welches Material es geht, braucht es mehr oder weniger Energie. Aber wenn ich zum Beispiel Beton oder Stahl habe, da geht natürlich wahnsinnig viel Energie rein und die ist gebunden in diesen Produkten.
I have a Nash theory that it's not just the building that are the issue here. I see the demolition of social housing. Even in an age where there is a massive housing shortage, the ongoing demolition of social housing, a weirdly ironic thing. And for me, it is part of an ongoing attack on progressive values. You see it. There is a very carefully constructed campaign against those buildings, where first the poorest of societies are put in there, then there is cost cut after cost cut after cost cut, then a bad situation emerges in the building that is then being used as an argument against the building.
Ich glaube, das ist ein Aspekt, den man nicht unberücksichtigt lassen darf, was auch zerstört wird, wenn bestimmte Quartiere zum Beispiel abgerissen werden. Da leben vielleicht Menschen, die sich gerade diesen bezahlbaren Wohnraum leisten können, die da schon sehr lange leben. Mit einem Abriss riskiert man, dass genau solche Strukturen natürlich zerstört werden, weil viele Menschengruppen dann die finanziellen Mittel nicht mehr haben, dort weiterhin zu leben und zu wohnen. Das sind also auch Aspekte, die man mit betrachten muss, wenn man über Abriss spricht. Das sind nämlich nicht einfach Gebäude, sondern da steckt ganz viel Lebenszeit, Emotionalität, gesellschaftlicher Zusammenhalt in diesen Gebäuden und das sind Erinnerungen und deswegen engagieren sich auch so viele Menschen gegen diese Abrisse.
In this neoliberal logic, when you care just about maximizing your profit, of course all the rest, cultural heritage is nothing. I dare to say that there is a value to existing buildings that is even independent from these lists of monuments. There is a cultural component there that is extremely important to us in the society. The storytelling, let alone the CO2, which is embedded in all these buildings.
Und es fängt eben nicht bei dem vermeintlichen Recycling an, dass man sagt, das ist doch super, dann recyceln wir das alles und damit haben wir kein Problem mehr. Das stimmt nicht, weil ja für die Herstellung immer wieder Energie eingesetzt werden muss und neue Ressourcen eingesetzt werden müssen. Das heißt, es fängt vorher an. Es fängt an bei der Vermeidung. Und wenn ich das übertragen möchte auf Gebäude, dann fängt es an, Bestandsgebäude zu erhalten.
If I can sum up all the crises with which we are confronted, I would say that the sum of all of them is the fact that we reached the limits of a system. So the main problem is that actually things that have a huge value, they cannot be evaluated. There is no price. They don't have a price.
Ich denke, das Problem, das wir grundsätzlich haben, wenn es um den Gebäudesektor geht, ist, dass wir einen Perspektivwechsel brauchen. Es ist so, dass in diesem System, das geschaffen worden ist über viele Jahrzehnte hinweg, der Fokus auf dem Neubau liegt. Das kann man auch daran erkennen, dass die Fördergelder im Wesentlichen im Neubau gelandet sind. Und auch im ganzen Narrativ, was auch medial immer wieder transportiert wird, geht es eben nicht darum, zu sagen, wir unterstützen euch, wenn ihr alte Gebäude saniert und dann weiter bewohnt. Deswegen brauchen wir den Fokus auf den Bestand erhalten und wir müssen möglichst verhindern, dass abgerissen wird.
I would go further in this and say no demolition should be allowed except you prove that nothing can be done. Because in fact, the calculation, you can always make them good. So I think it should be a principle, no demolition, no arrangement.
Demolition is as outdated as food waste, animal testing, or single-use plastics. But while we have a common understanding of these issues, there's no public awareness of the consequences and potentials of the construction sector. On average, it contributes around 38% of global CO2 emissions. By contrast, flying generates only about 3.5%. Similarly, the building sector is the largest producer of waste in the EU, generating about 36% of all waste. By contrast, households generate only about 8%. On average, if a building is demolished and replaced, rents increased by approximately 20 to 30%, making it beyond ecological concerns, also a social issue. Renovation offers a truly sustainable alternative, merging social, ecological, and economic benefits. Currently, only about 11% of Europe's existing buildings undergo renovations, leaving 89% as untapped market potential. At the current renovation rate of around 1% per year, it would take almost a century to renovate Europe's building stock. So, how can we unlock the potential of the renovation and transformation market in Europe and develop a simple formula to convince both the market and the public?
And the question for me is simple. When you have one, it could mean one flat, one block, one slab. When you have one, you demolish one and you rebuild one. At the end, you have one. If you have one and you just add half of one, and at the end, you have 1.5. You spend less, you have more. And this is also what is related with ambition, and escaping from standard, producing better spaces for people. It's not luxury spaces. It is just to find a way by working with less to give more at the end. It is to think better, to be more intelligent in the way you do, you build, you reuse, you add to existing situations. But this ambition is absolutely necessary and for social housing or for any housing. This question of affordability, what is the best way for a building to be sustainable? I think it is generous. It is only because we are making these standard buildings everywhere, or we're repairing in a standard way, that finally these buildings, they have no interest, they have no excitement, they create no pleasure to live in, and finally after 10 years, after 20 years, they are unsuccessful anymore.
Also das eine ist natürlich jetzt diese Einsicht, also dass der Gebäudebestand wirklich eine veritable Rolle für den Klimaschutz in der Zukunft darstellt und eine wichtige Rolle spielt. Und wenn man sich das anguckt, dann ist natürlich der nächste Schritt, okay, was brauchen wir dafür eigentlich? Und da hat sich natürlich die Europäische Kommission gemeinsam mit den Mitgliedstaaten überlegt, wir brauchen eigentlich ein Wirtschaftsimpuls in dem Bereich.
What would happen if the entire labor force, which is currently used in new construction, would be rerouted into renovation? Well, instead of the 120 years that it will take for the entire housing stock of Switzerland to be renovated, it would take 12, which I think speaks of how reinventing our construction industry is never about losing jobs and never about destroying existing trades, but about rerouting them into a virtuous construction industry.
Das Argument, dass Arbeitsplätze vernichtet werden, weil man möglicherweise nicht mehr abreißen darf, um neu aufzubauen, ist aus meiner Sicht ehrlich gesagt ziemlicher Quatsch. Gerade die kleineren Betriebe, die überall zu finden sind, haben möglicherweise sogar ein höheres Interesse daran, Sanierungsarbeiten vorzunehmen, weil sie eventuell mit größeren Projekten das überhaupt nicht leistbar wäre. Und dazu kommt vielleicht auch nochmal dieser Aspekt, wenn man in der Gegend lebt, und das ist in Deutschland wie in vielen anderen Ländern, gibt es gewachsene Strukturen, da gibt es Arbeitersiedlungen mit altem Gebäudebestand, und Menschen, die dort leben, vielleicht auch eben Handwerker, haben vielleicht auch ein Gespür dafür, dann für diesen Erhalt.
This is about revolutionizing construction. Rethinking entirely how we assemble all these elements, for instance. Are they assembled in a way that they can be disassembled, of course, but also thinking about how a construction detail will be taken care of. Think about a window, for instance. Are you able to clean that window? Are you able to repaint that particular piece of the house, depending on how it's built and things like that? So revolutionizing construction also means by design.
Da kann man sich natürlich auch nochmal die Bürostrukturen in Europa anschauen. Und 92% der Büros in Europa bestehen aus 1- bis 5-Mann-Büros. Das heißt, diese Büros sind ja nicht international unterwegs. Die meisten sind wirklich ortsverbunden, arbeiten regional, kennen den Markt vor Ort, kennen die Handwerker, haben da ein entsprechendes Netzwerk. Und das sind natürlich dann für die Zukunft diejenigen, die auch dieses Ziel des Umbaus in die Breite tragen können.
So if we think of this construction industry and this construction sector as a commodity chain, so basically this idea that there is a complete chain of actors that are connected together in order to reach to the end product, which is ultimately, let's say, housing. When we think of this whole chain, there is the possibility to really say, well, if I intervene here, here, and there, the entire system can shift. And if we think about these actors, well, there is potential to interfere at every level. So we can interfere at the level of financing, which projects get financed, by whom, what are the criterias that banks or public actors with capital would choose to fund. Or we can jump somewhere else along the chain and think about what are the legal points of leverage, where can we intervene in the law.
Dann ist der erste Schritt gewesen, okay, wir haben den Green Deal. Green Deal ist eine strategische Ausrichtung über alle hinweg in Europa, also politisch. Der zweite Schritt war das Klimagesetz, wo man sich rechtsverbindlich auf die Klimaneutralität bis 2050 geeinigt hat. Und der dritte Schritt ist dann die Umsetzung. Und ein Teil dieser Umsetzung war die Renovation Wave. Und in dieser Renovation Wave wird die Dekarbonisierung unseres Gebäudebestandes in Angriff genommen. Ziel ist es, diese Renovierungsrate zu verdoppeln. Und andere Experten sprechen auch, man muss sie verdreifachen oder sogar vervierfachen. Und das bedeutet effektiv, wenn man das einfach übersetzt, jedes Büro im Moment müsste doppelt so viele Projekte bearbeiten.
Es geht darum, dass der Perspektivwechsel stattfindet, dass es diesen Wert erhält, den es faktisch hat, das bestehende Gebäude. Es wäre auch eine Idee zu sagen, dass es Steuererleichterungen gibt, dann wenn ich saniere, statt neu zu bauen. Es muss günstiger sein, zu sanieren, zu modernisieren und zu erweitern im Vergleich zum Bau auf der grünen Wiese.
My experience is that a lot of investors and a lot of entrepreneurs really would like to have those incentives, would like to work sustainably. They're like you and me, they too have a conscience, really. And so if we gave them incentives to do the right thing, which is keep this building, make sure that we reuse it effectively and use it for housing, rather than destroying it and giving it as an asset to a global bank.
Renovation and transformation are real alternatives, proven by thousands of examples and stories, lived by people across Europe and around the world, offering an affordable and sustainable way to live together.
We were just looking for an apartment to buy because we were renting before, and the rent was going up and up and up. I wanted to be able to have control about how much money I spent on living. We saw the ad in the paper for this project.
Actually, the advertisement was behind the front door. You're free to do whatever you want. Now, it was completely what they called casco in Dutch, so it had been left in the state that the last owners had been here.
Because they sold it casco, they took less risk. And nowadays, I think they make more profit by making it beautiful and then selling it. But because they didn't do that, they chose for the owner to make it a house of it.
One of many large-scale housing buildings, simple and robust, just like the countless office blocks, shopping malls, and parking garages we see all around us. The developers and architects recognized its potential. They renovated with minimal means, creating affordable spaces while saving both energy and stories.
So it was really, really cheap apartments when we bought it for Amsterdam. Yeah.
And a lot of stuff we could do ourselves, so we just saw the potential. And I always like the mix of old and new, and that you see a little bit of history, but also see the future. And yeah.
And living here in the Bijlmer, there's such a contrast as living in this concrete block, but there's so much nature around. It's outside of the city, but it's very urban.
They see the common path, that renovation is the best option. What we need are new EU laws to make renovation the new norm, by reducing taxes on renovation, by recognizing our impact of the past, by evaluating its potential for tomorrow. But despite all these arguments and potential, this too is a story of demolition. Because, in the end, it's a question of political will and vision.
And then they demolish a lot of flats. I wonder if that was really the solution, because they could also have renovated. It was not the flats itself. It was more the maid who wasn't there in the beginning. It was the services. So it was more those things than the flats itself, according to me as well.
A lot of people find it really ugly because it's no color on the building. I think it's really beautiful, but it's kind of a relative thing whether you like this or not. It's a great project, I think, as an example of how you can retool an urban monument, a piece of architecture, and not tear it down and throw it away. So you don't want to demolish a building like this until you're really sure you can't save it.
How can we build strong arguments for citizens, politicians, and the industry to recognize and value the already existing?
So the question always becomes, who's going to pay for this, right? It's really strange. Nobody asks that question when we go to war. Nobody asks that question when we have a pandemic and we have to nationalize the economy. And we nationalize the economy. We've nationalized capitalism and nobody batted an eyelid. At the height of the pandemic in April 2020, the banking system collapsed. It was catastrophic. It was as big a collapse as in 2007-9. People have forgotten about that. And what bailed them out? Central banks, taxpayers, ultimately, right? So we know that we can do these big things. We can finance it. Why? Because money is just the social construct. It's a promise to pay. If the bank gives me 300,000 euros, I promise to pay them back. And then those 300,000 euros go into the circulation in the economy. And then we lose sight of the fact that the way it was created was through this promise. And it's a social thing. We can change those promises. So we need to understand that money is something that we invented as human beings to enable us to undertake transactions. We've got to make it work for us instead of us working for money.
I think when it comes to the climate crisis, one of the myths that the problem is a technical problem. As an academic at Cambridge University, I can tell you very well that there's plenty of technical solutions of how to reduce emissions and respond. But why is it not happening? It's not happening because there's not enough political support. How do we change the system so that as many different groups of people as possible will be on board for economic transformation? That's how we need to think about it.
All of us in Europe, we are not only consumers, so we are not only contributing to climate change, we are also citizens who vote, and the more pressure there is to act against climate change, the more likely to do so. So I think we have this right to organize civil society campaigns, to organize petitions, to organize citizen initiatives. And I think, of course, we should use this right.
Well, if you think about democracy, I mean, democracy, on the one hand, is an idea, the idea that everyone, all the people participate in the system that governs them. And the only way to do it is to treat democracy as a habit. And it's not the system that you just set in a place. It's something that you need to do really on the everyday level. And then if you think about the law and the role of law in democracy, because rights, constitutional rights, human rights, any other rights, they are empty forms unless you fill them with meaning. And the only way you can fill them with meaning is through politics. You need to constantly empower the law with democratic politics.
There is something that is commonly called the wisdom of the crowd. But at the end of the day, we still need governments to act.
And if governments don't stand up for this, and if it's only the private sector saying, look, we promise you, you will get a good job, I'm not surprised they don't trust us. That's the really important element that we have to look at in that transition, is training and upskilling and changing.
Should we leave it to the country level? Should we carry it to the EU level? By and large, I would think there needs to be action at all these levels. The European Union negotiates and acts as a single country. So it contracts commitments there, then goes home and sees how it can implement, the overall targets across the 27 member states. And usually the others around it, like Switzerland, they simply copy what the European Union decides a bit later on.
And of course the policies for that are long and complex, and I won't go into them now. But it's about bringing the power back home to the people.
You want to start a family, but cannot afford a home. You want to build a future, but can only find temporary housing. You want to find a house, but functioning buildings are demolished. You want to save homes for our communities. You want to fight climate change for our existence. You want to create freedom for the next generation. You are not alone. We blame landlords for raising our rents. We blame developers for demolishing our buildings. We blame politicians for ruining our hometowns. We blame ourselves for not working harder, not saving more, not being richer. We are anxious, angry, alienated. But don't worry. Together we can transform this system and renovate existing buildings to house Europe. Because renovation is the best option. The only thing we need now is laws to make renovation cheaper, faster, and easier. The EU has the power to change this. You have the power to change this. Support House Europe. Now.